So welcome everybody to this webinar on Elpical Claro. Claro is a solution for automatic image optimization used by publishers around the world, renowned publishers around the world, but also finds its application more and more into other industries, such as the print-on-demand industry, specifically with applications such as photo albums and wishing cards. So we'll get going talking about Elpical Claro, giving an overview of Elpical Claro, and then maybe zooming in on some of the novelties in the latest version. Very short intro on Elpical for those people who would be interested. So Elpical has been around for a while, since 1997, has focused since then mainly on image optimization, has offices in the Netherlands and in Germany, customers around the world, and we really mean around the world, both in Europe, the Americas, Asia, and so forth. I wanted to start with a couple of slides on Claro before we dig into the application itself. At the core of Claro is Claro's individual image analysis. With Claro, we always focus on the automatic correction. In order to correct, you need to be able to assess what the quality of the image is. This is the task typically that a retoucher takes upon him or her. And so this is the crucial task. We need to know what the image is like, what the base quality of the image is like, before we can apply any correction. And this is what this Claro individual image analysis is for. This is also what makes Claro very different from any type of regular batch processing. This is a question that we often get from customers that discover Claro. Is in Photoshop I have the possibility to do batch processing, and I'm able to be more productive and to automate some of the tasks that I would be doing with from an image retouching point of view with Photoshop. The big difference in that is that all those corrections that you make in batch processing are linear corrections. So they don't take into account the base quality of the image, the base characteristics of the image. That's where the individual image analysis from Claro kicks in. This also means that as there is an image analysis, that as a consequence, all the corrections that are made will be dynamic based on that assessment. And that no matter what the source of the image is, that Claro will try to standardize the quality, but also the atmosphere, the overall feeling of an image. And that is ultimately the goal. So the goal with Claro is that obviously we try to increase the quality of the images, but also that we try to get some consistency in the atmosphere of the image, so that whether it is in a magazine, in a newspaper, in a catalog, in a photo book, or in any other type of publication or printed product, we get a similar result regardless of the origin of the image. As we said, the second phase is the enhancement. So that enhancement is dynamic based on the analysis. And for the enhancement, you get full control of the level of enhancement that you want to apply. This will become more clear when we get into the product, but contrary to, once again, the example that we took in batch processing with Photoshop, in batch processing, you will define that you want more clarity, that you want more contrast. What we will define in Claro is not whether we want more or less, but what is the output level that we would like to achieve, regardless of what the input level is. So if we have already quite clear images combined with darker images, Claro will try to standardize that level throughout the different images that it processes. You will also be able to apply local enhancements in shadows and highlights, but also specific enhancements in skin tones, natural greens, and blues. When you implement Claro in a workflow, the goal is that Claro will adapt itself to the way that you work. So you will see that Claro has quite a bit of options and possibilities on how to be integrated. The entire goal is that Claro adapts itself to the way you work rather than you have to adapt yourself to the way that Claro works. In that way, one of the very important elements is that you can opt for a fully automatic workflow, but you can also opt for a workflow that integrates with Photoshop, and where rather than just copying files into an input folder and then getting them processed in the output folder, you're able to verify, to look at the original image and the processed image side by side in Photoshop and see if you want to apply any additional corrections to the image files that have been processed. Now then, sometimes the remark is, why would I still need Claro if I'm still going to review the images anyways? Well, it's very simple. It's a question of productivity. What we try to do is already process the images by forehand on a server without that the operator has to touch them. So the standard optimizations are already done by Claro. And then the operator can really focus on the task where he adds value, looking at those pictures that might require human interaction, that might require the real value add of the human eye, and add some specific corrections to that. All that while the base processing has already been done by Claro. If we look at the Claro workflow, we have a hot folder based workflow, so we will be copying files in a hot folder called, in the Claro terminology, a channel. The files will be processed by that channel with its specific settings. And as I mentioned, there is an application called the Photoshop Inspector that will allow the user to check images, either just to check them all or just to check problem images. So that too we're going to see in the application, how to define what we would consider problem images, to perform some kind of a pre-flight check on the images by Claro, and then send the images before and after, so the original image and the processed image, to Photoshop to allow an operator to have a closer look at them, or with all the tools that the operator has available within Photoshop to further tweak that image. There is another aspect when it comes to workflow, that is the InDesign job client. The InDesign job client is a plugin for InDesign where you're able to send the images, to submit the images directly from within your page layout to Claro, and to have them processed by Claro and recuperate them back into your InDesign layout. So the job client actually handles all the communication between InDesign and Claro, sending the raw images into Claro and retrieving the processed images once again within InDesign, processed within their specific context. This once again gets us into how does Claro adapt to your workflow. You could process the images as they are coming in at reception and just process the images without any context. Without any cropping information, without any resize information. The big advantage of working with the InDesign job client is that we will take into account for the processing the cropping and the sizing based on the way the image has been placed in the image box in InDesign. Specifically for sharpening, for instance, if you resize an image within InDesign, the way that sharpening will be applied would be different than if you just take an image at 100%. Also for cropping, this is important. We have what we define as soft cropping and hard cropping within Claro. Soft cropping being the image optimization that is done based on the frame, the part of the image that is actually being used in your page layout. So if I have a dark area outside of my image frame, that dark area will not be taken into account for the image analysis and for the image correction. Obviously, the correction at the end will be done on the entire image. However, for the image analysis and the correction, it is only the part that is used in your page layout that will be taken into account. There is also the notion of hard cropping, where Claro will entirely crop the image, physically crop the image to the part that is being used. So the big advantage that we have there is that all the part of the image that we don't really need in our page layout will be cut off, and I will have significantly lighter files at output. When we talk about file formats, Claro takes all common image file formats, so that's PNG, TIFF, Photoshop files, RAW files, and so on and so forth. Important to understand with Photoshop files and with TIFF files is that there is a comprehensive layer support. So here on the slide, it says comprehensive Photoshop file format support. But what that actually means is that Claro will handle both on input and on output multi-layered files. And we'll talk about that a little bit more during the demo. And then Claro will also handle PDF doc. Once again, if you talk about the flexibility of Claro, that is an important aspect. We talked in the previous slide about how Claro can take in the images as they come in as one alternative, a second alternative to work from within InDesign and send images with context information on how they're being used in the page layout. Working with PDF has similar advantages. So you can process a fully laid out PDF file, a fully made up PDF file. Claro will extract the images out of the PDF file, taking into account, once again, the scaling and the cropping on how they're placed in the PDF file, optimize them, and reinsert them in the PDF file. Once again, depending on the workflow that you have, where you want to do the image optimization, where the files come from, either one of those workflows and using Claro in either one of those places in the workflow can be applicable. When we talk about the Claro USPs today, I believe that Claro offers the highest quality analysis based on automatic image enhancement. You really have all the workflow options that you would need, doing either automatic or semi-automatic workflow, or use pre-toning, meaning where you might do a first processing as images come in, and then a final processing either in integration with InDesign or on PDF. We have the integrations with Photoshop and InDesign. We have a very comprehensive multi-layer support. Claro today, on a base license, offers multi-processing with up to 4 concurrent processes on a single license. And next to some of the out-of-the-box workflow integrations that we talked about, such as InDesign or PDF, there's also an extensive web services API or an integration that is possible through XML job tickets. There is a cluster and auto failover or load balancing setup as well. So if you have either mission critical production or if you have high peaks in your production, you can install 2 licenses of Claro on 2 separate servers, appearing to the actual user as one instance. So you have actually two instances appearing to the customer as one instance, offering the safety of when one server falls out, when one server fails, that the other one entirely takes over, but also with the ability at the same time to fully transparently to the user balance the load over two servers if you choose for that setup. So that being said, let us dig into the demo itself. I'll hide the presentation first. And before I actually get into how you configure the system, let me first show you how Claro is being used in combination with the Photoshop inspector. So you see the Photoshop inspector right here. Photoshop inspector is not a plugin to Photoshop. However, it's an application that interacts with Photoshop. I can define in Claro, as I said, different types of workflows. I can define a fully automatic workflow. I can define a workflow in which all images will be sent to the inspector for review by my operator. And I can define some kind of an intermediate workflow where I will rely on Claro to do some kind of pre-flight on the file, see if Claro can make the corrections that it esteems necessary or not. And if Claro esteems it will not be capable of providing that correction, then it will send the images to the Photoshop inspector. So I'm opening my window and my two pictures right here. And I am now looking at my two pictures. There is some kind of a strange shadow of my startup screen that appears in here. So let me quickly zoom out there. So the standard workflow the standard setup that you'll see in Claro in combination with Photoshop is that on the left-hand side, I will have the original file, and on the right-hand side, I will have the processed file in there. So you see that the correction, you can now clearly see which corrections are being made here. My inspector window is a dynamic window, so it will change the information that it displays based on whether the images are open, yes or no. So I see here the channel that has been used to process the image. I see the original name of my image. And I also see all the processing information here in my window. Should I have any additional metadata, I can see that as well. Now, let me zoom in here to 100%. And you will see some of the corrections that have been made here. I can now choose whether I want the original image or the processed image to continue further in the workflow. So in this case, I will choose the processed image. And so I'm ignoring any open and close actions in Claro. In Photoshop, this is something that the inspector handles. So if I choose my next image, it will automatically open that next image, and I will see once again the before and after results on the left, respectively, and on the right of my Photoshop workspace. Once again, I will choose my processed image. One of the other things I can do, instead of just going one image at a time and each time clicking next, is that here I have my queue. In the queue, I will basically find all the images that have been processed already. And what I can do here is I can simply double click on an image and select that image and open that image right there. So you see clearly the level of detail, how that has been increased here on the processed image. Once again, apologizing for that Photoshop frame that is bothering us there a little bit. Here, what I again can choose is the processed image, and I go back to my queue. Now, if I see a couple of images that have been processed, well, if I've looked at that previous jewelry image, for instance, and I like the way that that has been processed, if I have similar images in my queue, what I can do here is I can select these images and right here just say I want to use the processed image for these images that I have selected. Yeah. So while I am still reviewing some of the images, this also allows me to be significantly more productive in the way that I handle specific files. I'll have another look at this specific image. Yeah. Where you also see to a certain extent the level that it has, the impact that it has, for instance, on the greens of the grass, but also on the neutrality of the image. So we see here that there is a blue cast on top of that in that image, and that we have here on the processed image neutralized that image to be to have a more neutral tone and to have gotten rid of that that blue cast that we have in there. Once again, I can choose my processed image and continue with the rest of my images. I will leave those images as they are and actually get back to the configuration of Claro. So I'll minimize this part. And here I am in the Claro administration. The Claro administration is going to allow me to set up my different channels. And so what I see here is my channel groups. So first of all, I see here that I've got a channel in red. This means that this channel has been switched off. I can change the status of that, and I can switch that on if I wanted to, and switch that back off again. I see here, so I can divide my different channels into different groups per different subjects, per different magazines that I might have. This is just one of the tools that will allow you to keep an overview of the different channels that you have. If we double click on a channel, we'll be able to open one and to get into the details of the configuration. So typically what we define first is the source folder, meaning the input folder of this channel. I am able to scan subfolders. This is quite important if I have a big set of images that I need to process. If I have an entire folder hierarchy that I want to process with images in subfolders on different levels, I'm able to scan those subfolders, and I'm also at the end on the output to be able to reconstitute the entire folder hierarchy. Important to understand is that the analysis of the images and the optimization is actually being done in RGB. So if I have non-RGB images, there are basically two things that I can do with them. I can either take them out of the workflow and consider them as processed images already, or I will need to convert them to RGB. And here are basically, here is the color setup with the different I2C profiles that I want to use in order to convert the images to RGB. In the slides, I talked about multi-layer compatibility. Once again, we're at the input of the workflow here. So I'm going to define at input what I want to do with a multi-layered file. At the output side, I will be able just later on to define what I want to do there with multi-layered files. But in this case, I'm basically able to define which layer in a multi-layered file I want to process. By default, we will want to process the compatibility layer. But once again, Claro being flexible, it will adapt to any workflow that you want. So if you want to rather process the top visible one, the bottom visible one, the top real one, the bottom real one, or a layer with a specific name, call that final, for instance, then it will process that specific layer as you want. We get to the sizing of the image. So we can first of all set the DPI. If the DPI as such has not been defined, and if we just have physical resolution has not been set, but I just have the definition of my image in pixels, I can here define that I want that image to be set to 300 dpi, and that it will derive the physical dimensions of that image based on the resolution that I've defined here. If I wanted to, I could obviously also resize, resample the image and define what the specific size is after resampling. So I can define the width, the height in pixels, or I could define what the longest side should be, either in pixels or in inches. I can change the orientation based on EXIF information. So if in the EXIF information I see that this should be a portrait image, but we actually see that this is that the image is on its side, then it will automatically rotate the image correctly. And then I can define the maximum size of the image at the input, at the output, or even define what the maximum file size should be in megabytes on the input side. When we get to the quality check, here is where we'll actually perform the pre-flight of the image. So first of all, I'm going to define whether I want to reject bad images, yes or no. So I just activate or deactivate that option right here. And then I'm going to define on which criteria I want to reject bad images. So in this case, that can be color balance, brightness, sharpness, and noise to start off with. And we're going to define whether we do not want to reject on this specific criteria, or whether we want to be very strict, and anything in between that, of course. This is basically going to this is going to be defined by how demanding you are on the quality of the images on one hand, but also on the bandwidth that you have at the back end of that to review the images. You can be very demanding on one hand, but if behind this you do not have the operators to have a look at all the images that have been rejected, then you might be more flexible in those criteria right here. So I can individually reject or not reject based on your color balance, brightness, sharpness, and noise. I can also define and reject images if the amount of colors that are out of gamut, looking at the input color space and the output color space, is going to be larger than 30% in this case. Also, we can look at the resize factor. Now, the resize factor, that can be defined by how we define the size here in this part of the configuration, but in interaction with the InDesign job client, it can also be defined by how much an image has been resized in InDesign, or if we have an integration through the API or through the XML integration with an editorial system or with another automation system, the resize factor can also come from that third-party system. And so we could reject that based on that as well. Lastly, we can also reject images based on the fact of whether they are CMYK, whether they have no embedded profile, or whether red eyes have been detected in the image. I'll get back to red eye detection in just a little bit. So as you already figured, the different steps here in the configuration follow a certain logic. So I need to resize, I need to define the size first before I want to be able to reject images based on their resize factor. I need to define whether I want to reject bad images in order to define what I want my workflow to be. Now, now that I have checked the quality of my images, I can define whether I want to send all the images to the inspector, whether I want to send the rejected images to the inspector, whether I want to send the rejected images just to a separate folder, or whether I want all the images to be processed automatically. Once again, if you send the images to an unprocessed folder, I can mirror the input structure of those folders, the input hierarchy of those folders into that unprocessed folder right there. I can apply output conversion either on original images or on processed images or both. So if you want to see what the effect is of just applying the color profile, you could say, okay, I want to see CMYK conversion on both original images and on processed images. Obviously, if you want to see what the original color looked like at the non-converted RGB image, I would switch that off and I would keep my original image in its original color space, and then compare that to the converted image right there in the inspector. So in this case, and also as I've shown you in my example, the original image will be in RGB and the processed image was in CMYK. Now we get to the core of the image enhancement, and I go back to what I talked about in my slide. We said that the corrections that are applied to the images are dynamic. So what I'm going to define here in the image enhancement is not whether I want more sharpness or less sharpness. I am going to define what the output level of sharpness is that I want. If I do not want to apply sharpness in this specific case, I simply deselect the sharpness feature, and there will be no unsharp masking that is going to be applied to my image. If I do want unsharp masking to be applied, I'm going to activate it. And then the 0 value is the default value of Claro. So if I have already very sharp images and this default value is on 0, chances are that there will not be any additional unsharp masking that is going to be applied. Now, in the specific case of sharpness, that still might be the case. Claro has a tendency of producing quite sharp images. So what I could actually do is I could reduce this number here if I think that the default value of Claro is actually a little bit too sharp to my liking. I can reduce this setting to -1, for instance, and I will still, in many cases, apply an unsharp masking filter to my images because they are considered to be less sharp than this -1 value that I have here in Claro. The same goes for the brightness, the contrast, and the saturation. I can set the black point and the white point, either one or both. I can apply a noise filter on noisy images. I can apply local contrast in shadows and local contrast in highlights, excluding skin tones if I think that that has an undesirable effect right in there. And I can neutralize my images selecting the color balance feature. One of the things that are new since version 11 is that I'm able to suppress JPEG artifacts. The JPEG artifact suppression has specifically an effect on larger color surfaces, such as skies or water surfaces. So this is a feature that is currently still quite heavily under development. I know that additional artifacts are taken into consideration for correction, but today it is mainly on larger parts of an image where you have a vignette or anything like that, where you'll find artifacts where this function will have quite a good effect. In this case, I'd like to go also into the advanced features of the image enhancement, where we're specifically able to intervene on what we consider to be the black point and the white point. So if I don't want my white point to be 100% burnt, 100% white, then I can adjust that right here. I said I was going to come back on red eyes. Well, here I go. In the specific color tab, I'm able to remove red eyes. So if I detected red eyes, I'm able to remove that. Now, in case I want to avoid any false red eyes detection, I could also say only remove red eyes if we see in the exit information, so in the metadata of the camera, that a flash has been used. The strength is going to define the range of colors that is being affected, and this is something that we'll find back in these other tabs as well. So you will always have a zone, a transition zone between the actual red of the red eyes and the actual color of the eyes. Here we're going to define what is the impact on which color range. So the higher that I go here, the larger the color range that will be impacted by this correction. Then I'm able to go into the different color corrections. So for scan operators, this is typically something that they have to get their head around and have to start thinking a little bit different. So what you have in Claro is dynamic correction. So I cannot say, oh, I want my images to be more yellow or more blue. What I can do is I can define my specific atmosphere. And in order to define the specific atmosphere, Claro allows you to intervene, to correct those colors that have a large impact on the overall atmosphere of the image. So those are the skin tones, the greens and the blues. With the skin tones, I can apply a skin tone adjustment. So I can either make them cooler or warmer, redder, more red or more yellow. And so I can simply adjust and move that slider in one direction or the other, depending on my desired result. Once again, I understand that these are dynamic corrections that are being made, so that if I have already more yellowish skin tones in certain images, those will not necessarily be corrected. However, those images where I have kind of red faces because people are standing in the cold or anything like that, those will be corrected. I can also change here the strength of the range of colors that will be impacted, just as I explained with the red eyes. With these color corrections, I don't necessarily have to change the tone. I can simply deselect the skin tone adjustment and just play with one of the other or both of the other parameters that I have here. So if in general I would like to brighten my skin tones, but I do not want to brighten all the rest of my image, then in my image enhancement, I might choose a lower value here, but then in my color correction, I will say, okay, I want a little bit more brightness right here. And so depending once again on the source of my image, if I have, generally speaking, dark skin tones, this will brighten up my skin tones for those images, but it will maintain the brightness level in the rest of my image. Typically, if I have portraits and I want the people to stand out a little bit more, this is one of the settings that I could use. I have the same principle for my greens. So if I have grass or if I have other plants with a lot of green in there, I could either make those greens warmer or colder. With one of the examples that we had for our customers, they have outdoor magazines where they want to, depending on the time that that magazine comes out, where they want the greens to be warmer in the summer and colder in the winter. This would be the exact area of Claro where you make those adjustments. So they would have a winter green channel and a summer green channel, adjusting the tone of the greens depending on the season. What you have to understand is that these corrections, they can be subtle or they can be quite harsh. In another example, we had a publisher that published that is still publishing a golf magazine. In those golf magazines, they want the green always to be warm because they want it to be very appealing to go to these golf resorts. So we had for that magazine a very extreme setting, really pushing those greens all into yellowish warm greens to make them nicely warm and appealing. I'm repeating myself, but those adjustments, they were obviously only made in those areas where they needed to be made. So going back to the example of the golf magazines, those pictures that were taken in Miami in the summer, they were there. The greens were already quite yellowish, and so the adjustment, the additional correction that was made on those images was virtually none or very subtle. Those images where there was a golf course photographed in Scandinavia, obviously there the adjustment was significantly stronger. And then we have that same logic for the blues, where once again we can adjust here those blue tones. We could also suppress banding. This is an addition to the artifact suppression a little bit. You will have banding in skies. This is one of the frequent errors that are being made. And so suppressing the banding, activating the suppressing banding option will make the corrections clearer. So that is for those blue tones. I can also apply a color filter. When applying that color filter, very often I get the request whether this will make images sepia. That's not the case, so I will apply either a warming or a cooling on the images, depending on the color that I choose here. And there's already certain levels of warming or cooling that have been predefined. I could keep natural colors neutral, keep neutral colors neutral, of course. I could exclude sky colors and skin tones. So have this atmosphere, this warming or this cooling applied mainly on the background rather than on these neutral colors, the skies and the skin tones. If I process PDF images, I have a number of parameters right here to make sure that I'm only taking into account real images. I might have bitmap elements in my PDF that are not really images, that are logos or other elements. These are some ways to ignore those images. Also, the CMYK images or grayscale images can be ignored. If I have already pre-processed some of the images, I could skip certain files that have specific XMP data in there. So if I have metadata in the file that allows me to identify that these files have already been processed, this gives me the opportunity to identify and ignore those images. Just as a last side note on the PDF side here, I could also extract all the images from a PDF into a separate folder. Sometimes we have that request of customers that want to reuse the images that they find back in a PDF and repurpose those either for online publishing or other applications. And so you could also simply use Claro to extract the images from your PDF and put them into a specific folder. We get to the output conversion. On the output conversion, I can basically define the ICC profile for my color images, and I have a list of profiles that come with the software, but you could obviously also use any custom profile that you've built yourself. I could use the specific ICC profile for black and white images, and I can define my output rendering intent that by default would be perceptual, but that I can define to be relative or relative with black point compensation or absolute in case that the number of colors that I have out of gamut is higher than a certain percentage. On the output side, I obviously define what my destination folder is and what my output file format is. I can define the file format of the original. So if I have a JPEG coming in, I'll have a JPEG going out. If I have a TIFF coming in, I will have a TIFF going out. However, I can also standardize the file format right here. I can define a prefix, a suffix, and what have you, and I can mirror the input folders to my output, going back to what I said earlier, where I can reconstitute the structure of my folders on the output side. If I want, I can also send my files to a certain FTP folder. We see more and more people that are doing, for instance, mask application or specific retouching that outside of, in Europe, outside of Europe, or more particularly in Asia, if you have specific files that need to have some specific processing done, you could also automate sending that to your outsourced partner right here. With the multi-layer options, I can keep my original layers. I could only keep them if they have an alpha mask right there. I can keep my original layer as a specific layer and my processed image as a specific layer. So even if I have a single layer image on the input, I could output that as a multi-layer image on the output, having my original and my processed file as separate layers in the same file. I can add XMP logging and other information to my file. So going back to what I said in PDF file, where I could be identifying whether a file has been processed already, you can do that by adding the processing information to the XMP. I could also add IPTC information. So for those people that don't know IPTC, that is an image-specific metadata format that allows me to define, in this case, specific fields to be set to a specific value. And in the advanced section here, I could also strip out all metadata information if I wanted to. I can also add a watermark here, so I can add an image to a part of that image, whether that is copyright information or a logo, and define the size, the transparency, position, and the color of that image. Right, so that has given us a view on a processing channel. I quickly want to show you that there's also the possibility to add a routing channel. Routing channel will be able to route images to other channels, creating a one-to-many workflow where I will be able, based on either physical criteria or based on metadata, I'll be able to route images to one processing channel or another. I'm able to define also a device link channel, doing device link conversions on images, also defining the total area coverage, for instance, on the output. And I'm able to create a purging channel, basically allowing me to empty a specific folder every X time. That is a very quick overview of Claro. The last thing that I want to show you, and I would like to get into the time constraint that we've set ourselves of 1 hour, but is here the plugin for InDesign. So what you see here is that plugin where I am basically able to define whether I want to send selected images, all the images on the page, or all the images in this document to Claro. I'm able to add those to the queue, and I'm able to define which channel that I want to send those to. And then it is a question of starting my job and sending those. So that is the idea of Claro. We did get a question on whether these were all the features or just the new features. Yes, indeed, those were all the features that we covered today, because we always have a mix in audience of people that are new to the application and some people that know the features already. So we have provided a full overview looking both at new features and the existing features of Claro. If you have any additional questions, feel free to send me your email. If you want a trial version, you can find that on our website, but I'd also be happy to guide you through that. So just send me an email at tom.per@4piece.com, and we will be happy to accommodate a trial that you want to set up. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon or rest of the day, depending on where you are. And we hope to see you back in one of our future webinars. You will see that we have more webinars coming up. So if you go to our website, you will, in the company section and the events section, find an overview of the different events that we're going to. So we have a webinar on PDF Toolbox coming up, and we have some other webinars and events coming up. So if you're interested, feel free to have a look at that page and join us there. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.